Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Human Physiology module, MEDI 2107. Today we are going to talk about one of the most important concepts in physiology, and this concept is homeostasis. We are going to encounter this concept throughout the course. The objectives of today's lecture is to explain the meaning of the term internal environment and homeostasis and appreciate the importance of constancy of the statics or the interior environment or the milieu interior. Second objective is to state that homeostasis involves maintaining the internal environment at a constant level within a very narrow limit that is compatible with life. The third objective is to explain that homeostasis involves monitoring levels of variables and correcting changes. And then to understand the different components of a feedback system and contrast the operation of the two types of the feedback system, which are negative and positive feedback system or mechanism, and giving examples of each type of feedback mechanism. Let's quickly remember the meaning of very important terms. First, anatomy is the study of body structures and the relationships among them. Then physiology is the study of body functions, including the study of homeostasis, which is the topic of today's lecture. And pathophysiology is to study how physiological processes are altered in diseases or injury. Structure and function are so closely related. Structure mirrors function. Example, the thin air sacs of the lungs permit movement of gases from the lungs or the alveoli into the blood. As you remember, the human body has 6 levels of structural organization. These levels start with the chemical level, where atoms combine to form molecules. Then different molecules will combine together to form the different organelles of the cell membrane, as well as the cytoplasm, and this will give us the cellular level. Then cells of similar structure and function combine together to give me tissues, and we have here the third level, which is the tissue level. And we know that we have 4 basic types of tissues. These are the epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and neuronal tissue. Then different tissues will combine 2 or more different tissues, will work together to perform a certain function, and this will give me the organ level. Then the different organs that perform functions that are related to each other will combine to form the organ system level, and the different organ systems together will form the last level, which is the organ system. Here in this slide we can see the 6 levels: the chemical level, cellular level, tissue level, organ level, and organ system level, and finally the entire organism level that is made up of the organ systems, the 12 different organ systems that make up the human body. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a steady state in the body's internal environment despite changes in the external environment that surrounds us. Changes in temperature, for example, in humidity, in the oxygen level, usually does not affect the function of our body, because we have very efficient homeostatic mechanisms that keep our function. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a steady state in the body's internal environment despite changes in the external environment. Changes in the external environment, like changes in temperature, humidity, and oxygen level, usually do not affect the function of our body cells, because we have very efficient homeostasis. Homeostasis is a condition of equilibrium or balance in the body's internal environment. As I said, homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, and the term homeostasis is derived from two Greek words. These are homeo, which means unchanging or similar, and stasis, which means standing or remaining. So the word or the term homeostasis means staying the same or remaining similar. It is a dynamic condition meant to keep body functions in the narrow range compatible with maintaining life. What should stay the same? It is the internal environment. And what is the internal environment? It is the conditions inside an organism, and we are mainly talking about the extracellular fluid, and out of that the interstitial fluid is of utmost importance. Therefore, cellular function depends on the regulation of composition of the internal environment. The French scientist or the French physiologist Claude Bernard was among the first people or scientists who found or who wrote about the relation between the proper function of the cells and the composition of their surrounding environment or surrounding fluid, which is the interstitial fluid. So he wrote that proper functioning of the cells depends on the precise regulation of the composition of their surrounding fluid. He called the surrounding fluid the internal environment. This is the underlying principle of homeostasis. Homeostasis and body fluids. An important aspect of homeostasis is maintaining the volume and composition of body fluids. Body fluids are defined as dilute watery solutions containing dissolved chemicals inside or outside the cell. So body fluids exist inside the cells and also outside the cells, around the cells. The body fluid can be divided mainly into two types. Fluid inside the cells is called the intracellular fluid, and fluid outside the cells, and it is called the extracellular fluid. Here in this figure we can see that we have 4 cells and they contain this pink fluid, and this fluid inside the cells is called the intracellular fluid. These cells are bathed by an extracellular fluid that is present outside the cells, and it is composed of 2 main subcompartments. The fluid that exists between the cells, this is called the interstitial fluid, and this is, as I said, the extracellular fluid between the cells, and the fluid that is present inside the blood vessels of the cardiovascular system, or the liquid part of the blood, which is the plasma. You will study that in the blood section, that the blood is composed of cells, we call them the formed elements, and a liquid part, which is the plasma that contains proteins, ions, nutrients, hormones, and so on. There are also compartments in the body where we can find extracellular fluid, like the cerebrospinal fluid, which is present in special spaces inside and around the brain, and also inside and around the spinal cord. Also, another compartment where we can find extracellular fluid are the lymphatics, the lymphatic vessels. The fluid or liquid inside them is called lymph. The lubricant that is found inside the joints or certain types of joints, we call them the synovial joints, is also part of the extracellular fluid, and we call the synovial fluid. And again, in the eye, we have in the anterior chamber and posterior chamber, we have fluid, two types of fluids. We call them the aqueous humor and the vitreous body. The proper functioning of body cells depend on the regulation of the composition of the interstitial fluid, as I stated earlier. Here we can see a cell bathed with interstitial fluid, and a nearby capillary is present. The composition of the interstitial fluid changes continuously because substances move between the plasma and the interstitial fluid, and the backward and forward movement of these substances across the capillary wall to provide nutrients like glucose, oxygen and ions to the cells of the tissue and remove waste. So we have movement of materials from the blood, and these are oxygen and nutrients, and movement of the waste from the cell back to the blood vessel, and these movements will occur across the interstitial fluid that separates the blood vessel from the cell. And body cells work best if they have the correct volume of extracellular fluid, the correct blood volume, the correct blood pressure, the correct concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, correct concentrations of nutrients and waste products, and also correct concentration of electrolytes, pH of the internal environment, and so on. Our bodies have mechanisms to keep the cells in a constant internal environment that will help in maintaining the constant internal environment that is very important for the proper functioning of the cells. Examples of constancy of the internal environment is to keep body core temperature around 37, between 36.5 to 37.5, to keep blood pressure on average around 120 over 80 millimeter mercury, systolic and diastolic blood pressure, to keep the arterial partial pressure of oxygen around 100 millimeter mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide around 40 millimeter mercury, to keep blood sugar not more than 100 milligram per deciliter, or in the range of 70 to 100 milligram glucose per deciliter, to keep also the electrolytes within a narrow range, sodium around 140 millimole per liter, potassium around 4 millimole per liter, and also to keep the pH in different parts of the body at their normal range. For blood, for example, around 7.4, in the stomach between 2 and 4, and 8 in the small intestine, and around 8 in the urine. All body cells and systems contribute towards this constancy of these different variables. And the organ systems that help in the maintenance of homeostasis are all organ systems. The 12 organ systems, like the nervous system, endocrine system, cardiovascular, respiratory, gastrointestinal, excretory, musculoskeletal, integumentary, reproductive, and so on. How the homeostasis is controlled? Control of homeostasis is continually being disturbed by different factors, as I stated in the beginning of the lecture. It is disturbed by physical insults from the external environment, such as intense heat or lack of oxygen, or changes in the internal environment, such as drop in blood glucose due to lack of food. Psychological stress, such as demands of work or school, like during exams. In most cases, the disruption of homeostasis is mild and temporary, and the responses of the body cells quickly restore the balance of the internal environment. So just nothing will happen. Our function will remain on the safe side. In some cases, The disruption of homeostasis is severe or intense and often for prolonged time, and this usually will lead to disease, and if it is not corrected, this might lead to death. Control of homeostasis requires a communication system. Fortunately, the body systems, as we see in this figure, will maintain homeostasis, and this homeostasis is essential for the survival of the cells that make up the body system. So the homeostasis that is contributed by the cells of different organ systems will help to maintain the function of these cells. Fortunately, the body has many regulatory systems that can usually bring the internal environment back into balance. Most often, the nervous system and the endocrine system working together or independently provide the needed corrective measures. These are the most important communicating systems that control and harmonize the function of other organ systems to maintain homeostasis. The nervous system regulates homeostasis by sending electrical signals known as nerve impulses or action potentials that you will study inshallah in the coming lectures to the organs that counteract changes from the balanced state. And usually the actions mediated by the nervous system are very fast because action potentials are just electrical impulses or electrical signals that travel very fast down the neurons. The endocrine system is composed of different endocrine glands that release chemicals called hormones, and these hormones will work as messenger molecules, and usually these hormones will enter into the blood, circulate throughout the body, and they will act on cells, or they will affect cells that have the receptor for those hormones. Because the process includes the release of the hormone, circulation through the blood, and then action on the receptor on the target cells, usually the endocrine system will mediate slow changes or slow corrective measures. Both systems usually work through negative feedback systems. Homeostasis is maintained by feedback mechanism. So homeostasis, to be there is something called feedback system or feedback mechanism. What is feedback system or feedback loop? It is a cycle of events in which the state of the body is continually monitored, evaluated, and changed. For example, blood pressure is continuously monitored by special receptors in our circulation, evaluated by our brain, and changed accordingly. So we can keep our blood pressure within the narrow normal range that is compatible with life and without causing any damage to any organ. The output of a feedback system feeds back to either reverse or strengthen the action taken by the system. So we have even the response opposite to the stimulus, or the response is strengthening the stimulus. And this will give us the two types of feedback systems that I will explain in the coming. So the feedback system includes at least three basic components, and these are the receptor that will monitor or sense the changes in the environment, and we have a control or integrating center, and we have the effector that will produce the response or will reverse or strengthen the action. We have to familiarize ourselves with something called variable or the controlled condition. The variable is a value that changes Example, the body temperature, blood glucose, blood pressure, and so on. And there is another important term called set point. A set point is the normal range of the variable, and it is usually determined by the control or integrating center, and this normal range will permit the optimum operation of the system. For example, the set point for our body temperature is around 37, and this is set by the brain. The normal range for blood glucose is between 70 and 100 milligram per deciliter, and this is set by the beta cells in the pancreas, beta cells of the endocrine part of the pancreas. As I said, feedback system is a loop. As we can see here in this figure, the stimulus will disturb the homeostasis by acting on the receptor. The receptor will sense these changes and will send information to the control or integrating system in the form of nerve impulses or chemicals or hormones that will be released from the or by the endocrine organs. The control center or integrating center will compare this information with the set point that is present in the control center, and if it finds that the input is different from the set point, then it will send information in the form of nerve impulses or hormones to the effector organs. The effector organs are muscles of any type, skeletal muscles, smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or glands, either exocrine glands or endocrine glands, and this will give me the response that will reverse or strengthen the stimulus. So let's talk about the different components of a feedback system in more details. We said we have a receptor, we have an integrating or control center, and we have the effector. Let's start with the receptor. A receptor or sensor is a body structure that monitors changes in a controlled condition. As I said, like blood pressure, body temperature, blood glucose, and so on. The receptor will sense those changes and will send input to the control center. For example, we have specialized nerve endings in the skin that act as a thermoreceptor or temperature receptors, and changes in temperature will cause a nerve to fire in response to that change in temperature. And here we see a drawing an example of the nerve endings in the skin. The control or integrating center, the control center, sets the range of values to be maintained, and this is usually done by the brain. In some examples it is done by other tissues or tissues other than the brain, but most of the control centers are present in the brain. The control center evaluates input received from the receptors and compare them to the set point. Then it generates output commands or orders to the effector. Output involves nerve impulses, hormones, or other chemical agents. Examples: the brain acts as a control center, receiving nerve impulses from the skin thermoreceptors or the skin temperature receptor. Finally, or the last component of a feedback system is the effector, or it is the organ that will give me the response to the stimulus. The effector receives output from the control center and produces a response or effect that changes the controlled condition or variable to bring the system back to the set point. For example, high blood pressure through the feedback system, final result is bringing the blood pressure back to normal, as we'll see in the coming examples. Nearly every organ or tissue in our body can serve as an effector. As I said, the 3 different types of muscles and the 2 different types of glands, the exocrine and endocrine gland, all of them can act as effectors. Example, if body temperature drops, brain will send an impulse to the skeletal muscles to contract. This contraction will produce heat in the process of shivering, and this shivering will generate heat that will bring body temperature back to its normal level, around 37 degrees Celsius. Here we can see in this figure the interactions among the components of a homeostatic control system. First, the stimulus will produce change in the variable, and this change in the variable will be detected by the receptor or sensor. The receptor or sensor will send information either as hormones or as signals through the afferent pathway to the control integrating center. And as I said, most of the integrating centers or control centers are present in the central nervous system or brain. Then the control center will evaluate and compare that input with the set point, and if there is difference, it will send output in the form of information along the efferent pathway or as chemical signals in the form of hormones to the effector. The response that is brought about by the effector will lead or feedback to influence the magnitude of the stimulus and return the variable back to its normal value or back to value that falls within that normal range, which is compatible with life. Now, what are the types of feedback systems or feedback mechanisms? We have 2 types of feedback systems. We have a negative feedback system, and most our feedback system in the body are negative feedback system. So most of the examples of the human body fall under the negative feedback system category. And we have very few examples of positive feedback systems in our body. In the negative feedback system, the response reverses the change in the controlled condition, or just in a very simple way, the response will be opposite to the stimulus. For example, if the stimulus is an increase in blood pressure, the response is a decrease in blood pressure back to normal. In the positive feedback system, the response enhances or strengthens or enforces the changes in the body's controlled condition. Or in other words, the response is in the same direction of the stimulus. For example, if the stimulus is aggregation or adhesion of the platelets, the response is more aggregation or more adhesion of platelets, like what happens when our body tries to stop bleeding from an injured blood vessel. The negative feedback system tends to stabilize a system, so it corrects the deviation of the variable from the set point. So it brings that deviation of the variable back to the set point. In the positive feedback system, it tends to disturb the system, and this will take the variable away from the set point. Examples of negative feedback system are the regulation of blood pressure, regulation of body temperature, regulation of blood glucose, and tens of examples that you will encounter in the different organ systems that you will study in this module. Examples of positive feedback system is the normal childbirth and the process of blood clotting or hemostasis. Let's see some examples about homeostatic mechanism. Let's study this example, which is the first example about negative feedback system, which is the homeostatic regulation of blood pressure. As we see in this figure, the stimulus is an increase in blood pressure. The high blood pressure will stimulate special receptors in the large blood vessels near the heart, and these receptors are called baroreceptors because they sense changes in pressure. Stimulation of the baroreceptors will send nerve impulses to the control center that is present in the brainstem. The brainstem will compare the input with the set point and will decide to send nerve impulses to the effector organs, and in this case these are the heart and the blood vessels. So what will be the response? There will be decrease in the heart rate and increase in the diameter of blood vessels, we call vasodilation. Both together will decrease blood pressure back to normal. And you will study this in details in the cardiovascular system and also in the cardiovascular module in phase 2, inshallah. So what is the stimulus here? Is an increase in blood pressure. What are the receptors? These are the baroreceptors present in the major blood vessels near the heart, or in the great or in the large blood vessels near the heart. The control center is present in the brain and mainly in the brainstem, and the effector organs are the heart and blood vessels, and the response is a decrease in blood pressure back to normal. So the response is opposite to the stimulus. That's why we call this a negative feedback system, because the response reverses or is opposite to the stimulus. In the second example of negative feedback system is the homeostatic regulation of breathing in response to changes in arterial oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the stimulus, either in the form of a decrease in the arterial oxygen or an increase in the arterial carbon dioxide. So the stimulus is low oxygen in the blood or high carbon dioxide or even low pH, blood pH. This change will stimulate special receptors called peripheral chemoreceptors present in the aortic and carotid bodies, just in the large vessels near the heart, and also chemoreceptors present in the medulla oblongata, and we call these central chemoreceptors. So low oxygen, high carbon dioxide will stimulate peripheral and or central chemoreceptors, as you will study in details inshallah in the respiratory system, and send information to the control center present in the inspiratory area of the medulla oblongata. Again, the control center will compare the input with the set point, and since there is a difference, it will send nerve impulses to the effectors. In this case, the effectors are the respiratory muscles, both inspiratory muscles that are responsible for inspiration and expiratory muscles that are responsible for expiration or exhalation. And this will increase the frequency of breathing or pulmonary ventilation. So now we wash out carbon dioxide from the alveoli, and we bring fresh air that is rich in oxygen back to the alveoli, and then from the alveoli to the blood. So the end result is to decrease carbon dioxide in the blood and increase oxygen. And again, the response is opposite to the stimulus. That's why this example is another example of negative feedback system. Again, the stimulus is increase in arterial carbon dioxide or decrease in arterial oxygen. Receptors are chemoreceptors present centrally in the medulla oblongata or peripherally in the major blood vessels near the heart. Control center is the brainstem, and we talk about medulla oblongata. Effector organ is or are the respiratory muscles, both inspiratory muscles and expiratory muscles, and the response is opposite to the stimulus. The response here will be a decrease in the carbon dioxide and an increase in the oxygen. The third example of a negative feedback system is the control of body temperature. We know that humans maintain a constant body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. So if we look to the right side of the figure here, there are factors that increase body temperature. This increase in body temperature will be sensed by thermoreceptors in the skin, internal organs, and also in the brain, and input to the control center, which is the temperature regulating center in the brain, will activate or stimulate cooling mechanism in the body, like increasing blood flow to the skin, so we lose heat from the skin, sweating because evaporation of sweat will remove heat from the body, and also decrease metabolic rate, and this will lead to a decrease in body temperature back to normal. On the left side of the figure we can see an example where body temperature decreases. Again, this decrease in body temperature through the control center will initiate or activate heating mechanism in the form of decreased blood flow to the skin, which we call it cutaneous vasoconstriction, increased metabolism, and the repetitive contraction of the skeletal muscles, which is called shivering or known as shivering. And we know skeletal muscle contraction will produce or generate heat. So the generated heat will bring body temperature back to normal, back to 37 degrees Celsius. Now let's discuss two examples of positive feedback system. The first example is the control of labor, contractions during childbirth. During childbirth, the uterus will contract. This will stretch the uterine cervix. Stretching the uterine cervix will stimulate stretch receptors present in the cervix of the uterus. These receptors will send nerve impulses to the brain and then to the hypothalamus, and this will stimulate the release of hormone from the posterior pituitary gland. It is a gland that you will study in details, inshallah, in the endocrine system. Oxytocin is a hormone that will be released in the blood. It will circulate to the uterus, where it will act on the uterine smooth muscles, causing their contraction. Contraction of the uterus will push down the baby, and the head of the baby will cause further stretch of the uterine cervix, and this cycle will continue. That's why the stimulus is stretch of the cervix, and the response is further or stronger stretch of the cervix. That's why it is a good example of positive feedback system. The stimulus here is the stretch of the uterine cervix. Receptors are the stretch receptors in the cervix. Control center is in the brain. The effector organ are the uterine muscles, and the response is further or more stretch of the cervix. And this is a very good example of positive feedback system, where the response is in the same direction of the stimulus. So the positive feedback will cause the variable to continue in the same direction as the initial change, and you can see in this drawing or in this figure that the head of the baby will push against the cervix, and this will cause stretch of the cervix. Nerve impulses from the cervix will be transmitted to the brain. The brain will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete or release the posterior pituitary hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin, circulating or released into the blood, will reach the uterus through the circulation. This will cause further contraction of the uterine muscles and further stretch of the cervix, because the baby head will be pushed down during uterine contractions and will cause further stretch of the uterine cervix. This cycle will be stopped or will be broken by the delivery of the baby. So once the baby is delivered, the stretch of the cervix by the head will be relieved and the cycle is broken. Another example, or the second example of positive feedback system, is blood clotting, and usually we use the general term hemostasis. Be careful not to confuse yourself between homeostasis, which is the general concept, and hemostasis, which is an example of homeostasis. Hemo, the part hemo, or the word hemo means blood. So just the process of stopping bleeding, or to stop bleeding from an injured vessel. So in this example, we have a break or tear in the blood vessel wall. Platelets present in the blood, which are part or one type of the blood cells, will adhere to the or attach to the site of injury or damage in the blood vessels. The platelets will become activated, they will release certain chemicals, and this will attract more platelets to attach to the site of injury. So the stimulus is adhesion or aggregation of platelets, and the response is more and more aggregation or adhesion of platelets. That's why it is a positive feedback system. Homeostasis is very important to keep the normal function of the body, but sometimes we encounter homeostatic imbalances. What is a homeostatic imbalance? It occurs when the fine control of the variable falls outside the normal range. If the control system cannot maintain homeostasis, imbalance will occur. If the imbalance is mild or moderate, usually this will lead to disorder or disease, but if the imbalance is very strong or intense, this can lead to death. A disorder is just an abnormality of function, but if the imbalance is more, this will lead to disease or illness or pathology. Disease is characterized by symptoms and signs. Symptoms like headache, nausea, symptoms are the complaint of the patient, and the signs are what the clinician or the doctor sees on that patient. His observation, like measuring his temperature, measuring his blood pressure, he finds, for example, a paralysis of part of the body or limb. If the imbalance is severe, death may result. So failure of any component of a control system can result in a disturbance of homeostasis. So we have organism in homeostasis, we have external changes in the external environment that keeps changing the internal environment. If a disorder or disease condition adds an internal change, so the organism now is put at more challenge, the internal change will result in loss of homeostasis. Our organism will attempt to compensate for that loss. If the compensation fails, then illness or disease or even death will happen. If the homeostatic mechanism is successful or the compensation is successful, then well-being is maintained. With this slide, I finish the lecture. I hope that you enjoyed the content of the lecture and you understood the concept of homeostasis. Again, homeostasis is to keep a stable internal environment in a changing external environment. The internal environment means several variables like blood volume, blood pressure, the composition of the body fluids, the temperature, blood glucose, the concentration of different ions, the pH, and so on. Homeostasis is kept by certain mechanism, and usually the main contributor to homeostasis are tens of examples of negative feedback systems that usually bring the changes in the variable back to the set point, which is a narrow range of or limit that is compatible with life. Mild to moderate deviation from that set point, if the homeostatic mechanism fail to bring that variable back to the set point, will result in disease or illness, and in severe cases this can lead to death. Thank you very much, and inshallah I meet you in the coming lecture, and goodbye.